Hi, I am doing something unusual today with the video. We're gonna have a story time. I have so many books that I've read. I'm very behind. I can't wait to talk to you about all of them. But today's story time. So I work at a bookstore, and on Monday, I arrived at the same time as like a senior living bus. And out came these 20 beautiful women. We have groups like that come to the bookstore periodically, and it's always wonderful chaos. It's always wonderful chaos. um these lovely ladies, I went inside. I hadn't put my things down yet, and I'm just immediately scooped into the whirlwind of helping people find the things that they need. So the first woman that I talked to, her name was Mary, and she had this canvas tote, and she said, "You guys carry some of my poetry books, and I got an email that said or sounded like you wanted more of them, so I brought more of them." Now the gal that she's in charge of our local author program. She doesn't always work out of the bookstore. Sometimes she works in her office space, which is at our warehouse. But she was at the bookstore today, and she was already helping someone else. So I was like, you know what? The person who sent you that email would be my coworker who is here. Let me go just let her know that you're here, and as soon as she's done, she will help you. And so I let my coworker know, hey, we have one of our local authors here, got an email from you, if you could follow up when you're done. And then I told Mary, I'm going to circle back and just make sure you got taken care of. The second woman I helped was a woman named Nancy, and Nancy was looking for books by an author named Elizabeth Wetz, who I had never heard of before. And I was like, okay, do you know the title of the book you're looking for? She was like, no. And I was like, that's chill, that's fine. Let me go Google really quick. So I went to Google, W-E-T-S, W-E-T-T-S, W-E-T-Z, W-E-T-T-Z. Got nothing. Google knows no author named Elizabeth Wetz. So I was like, Nancy, Google doesn't know. Do you know what any of her books are about, plotline? She was like, yeah, I'm reading one right now that I'm really enjoying. It's about this woman who's in her 50s. Pardon me. She's in her 60s, but the book takes place during the 1950s. And she decides that she wants to ride a horse from Maine to California, and it's based on a real story. And I was like, oh, okay, I can probably figure it out from that. I'll go Google. 1 second. So I'm Googling. Elizabeth Letts with an L is the author. And I was like, okay. But Nancy has disappeared. So I'm looking, I'm checking behind shelves, and very softly, because it's a bookstore etiquette, Nancy. And there was this woman sitting on a chair who heard me and was like, and I was like, sorry, thinking that I had disturbed her bookstore etiquette sensibilities, because that happens even if you're quiet. And she was like, well, I'm Nancy. And I was like, oh, I'm looking for another Nancy, but how are you? And she was like, I'm good. And I was like, okay, well, wish me luck finding the other Nancy. And I eventually found her, and I was like, okay, I know her problem. It's Elizabeth Letts, not Elizabeth Wetz. And she was like, the font looks like a W. And I was like, yeah, sometimes the fonts get crazy. I get it. But let's go see if we have any Elizabeth Letts books. So we walk over, nothing. I've got nothing. And I was like, well, shoot. I was like, we can always look at ordering something in new for you. But special orders like that we place in a batch every Friday. And then they don't come for about a week. So if this was on Monday, which it was, it would be 2 weeks. And I was like, if you're wanting to get some fresh reading material for when you're done with your current book to take home with you today, let's see if we can think of something else. And I was like, do you like historical fiction? She was like, yes. And she was like, I really like the 1950s. And I was like, okay. I was like, oh, have you heard of the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society? And she was like, no. And I was like, okay. It takes place right after World War II, so I think we're in like 46, 47. It's not quite the 50s, but close. And I gave her like the pitch of the book, and she was like, okay, do you have a copy? And I had brought it up because I knew we had a few copies. And I was like, yeah, I definitely do. Let me take a quick second, I'll go grab it. So I found her a $5 autographed copy. And I came down and I was like, I have a $5 autographed copy. And some of the ladies that were around were like, $5 autographed? I was like, it happens every once in a while. And she was like, how did you hear about this book? And I was like, well, truthfully, there is a movie adaptation that came out a few years ago that I heard about, but when I realized it was an adaptation of a book, I read the book first. I found the book and read the book first, and it's wonderful. And then I watched the movie adaptation, and it's so, so cute. And the last time I checked, the movie was on Netflix. So when you're done with the book, is like a fun little treat. You can watch the movie if you want. You have access. And she was like, oh, okay. And so having found Nancy a book, I went to go check on Mary, and I was like, Mary, have you been helped? And she was like, yes. And we kind of walked and chatted for a second. She was like, I love coming here, but it also makes me really sad. And I was like, sad? Why does it make you sad? And she was like, because I moved last year and I had so many beautiful leather-bound books. She told me a number, and I don't want to hyperbolize, so I'm not going to fake a number for you, but if I remember correctly, it was multiple thousands. And I was like, oh, yeah, okay, yeah, I can absolutely see how that would be difficult. That would be a difficult feeling. And I was like, what are some of your favorites? You're a poet, but what are some of your favorite books? And she was like, well, I really love the classics. Faulkner, Steinbeck, Hemingway. And I was like, okay. And so we had just like the most beautiful chat about literature and books and life. She shared a few things about her life with me. And it was like such a lovely experience. And she shared with me that she was a potter. She'd had an active pottery studio all the way until last year when she moved. And she's written plays and had them performed. And I was like, oh, I did theater. I love that. I love that so much. Like, tell me about them. And so we had chats, and she mentioned Plath. And I was like, oh, I love Sylvia. I love Sylvia Plath. And she was like, you can have too much Plath, though. Which reminded me of, there's this bit in Persuasion. I found it so that I could have it to share with you when I did this video. There's this bit in Persuasion. This is this Barnes & Noble edition, and in this edition it's on page 96. I imagine it will be kind of similar in most editions. But Anne is, I believe, talking to Captain Benwick. Yes, Anne's talking to Captain Benwick. And there's this passage where it says, he repeated with such tremulous feeling the various lines which imaged a broken heart or a mind destroyed by wretchedness, and looked so entirely as if he meant to be understood, that she ventured to hope he did not always read only poetry, and to say that she thought it was the misfortune of poetry to be seldom safely enjoyed by those who enjoyed it completely, and that the strong feelings which alone could estimate it truly were the very feelings which ought to taste it but sparingly. So this character, Captain Benwick, is sad. He's grieving the loss of his fiancée. and he's reading a lot of poetry. And she is commenting that isn't it unfortunate that the nature of poetry, the people who can understand it, who appreciate it the most, should only taste of it sparingly, or else they're left even more in their grief. And in the, I think it's 2022 film adaptation of Persuasion, which I know is sort of divisive, I personally really like it. I actually had a wonderful conversation with one of my beloved cousins a couple weeks ago about how much we liked that movie, but that scene is depicted really beautifully in that movie. I think they did a really good job with it. Anyways, her comment about how you can have too much Plath made me think of that, and we chatted about that for a second. She was like, I actually wrote a poem about it. And I was like, did you? And we were standing right next to the local author's shelves where her books live. And she was like, yeah. She's like, let me... And she's like, I think it's in this one. Spoiler alert. I purchased one of her volumes of poetry. I believe she has 5. This one's called Ephemerons. And her full name is Mary Heyborne. 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 And this, I told you that she told me that she was a potter. This is a piece that she made, and she told me that each one of these little spouts represents one of the 9 muses, which is pretty cool. Anyways, she was like, yeah, she's like, I think it's in this one, and she opened it to the contents, and she was like, oh yeah, it's page 19. And she was like, read it. And I was like, right now? And she was like, yeah. And when I was in high school, in one of my English classes, I had a section on poetry. And my teacher was emphatic about poetry is meant to be experienced auditorily, whether you're reading it to yourself or you're hearing it spoken by someone else. It is meant to be heard. It's meant to be an auditory experience. And so she asked me to read it, and like, without really thinking about it, I was like, out loud? And she was like, yes. And then I was like, oh, I'm going to read this poem out loud to its author, to the poet herself. And I got a little nervous, but steeled myself to do the best job that I could. It's called Following Sylvia Plath. I grew up with Sylvia and her poems, works filled with madness, obsession, and pain. I tasted, devoured, yet feared the poems that set off explosions inside my brain. She claimed every decade she tried to die, adding she did it exceptionally well. I watched her at 30 look death in the eye and without blinking escape from her hell of ravenous lusts for fame, love, and sex. A faithless husband, herself half insane. The poems that she left were dark and complex, born of a tortured and terror-filled brain. We both wrote of tulips. Mine blazed, hers bled. Mine, symphonic and flamboyant blooms. Hers were too excitable and too red, and ate up the oxygen in her rooms. Her search for Daddy was one I had known. Our abandonments were common as breath. We both were enraptured by Keats and Dune and their fateful obsessions with death. I watched her and other known writers of love and death live in bondage, in thrall. Then, as Faulkner's Quentin, tortured by love, come to know they love death above all. And now I read Sylvia more and more. The peace and numbness she sought lures me too. She calls, seducing me up to the door, and I follow, but won't follow her through. And I'm like tearing up because we had been chatting for a while, and she told me a bit about her life that gave some context to this poem. And she smiled a big smile and gave me this hug. And she's small, and so she gave me this big hug, though. And we chatted for a little longer, and she said, the local author coordinator invited me to come and do a reading in the summer. And I was like, oh my gosh, that would be so lovely to have you here and hear you read your own poems. And she was like, yeah, I'm actually doing one tonight. And I was like, really? And she was like, yeah, I'm doing it at my center where I live. And I was like, that's so awesome. And we chatted, and then I was like, what time is your reading? And she said 6:30. And I went, and she went, could you come? And I said, I usually get off at 6:30, but I could probably leave at 6 and then just come a little early tomorrow. But where do you live? Where is it? And she told me, and I was like, oh, that totally works. That's close enough. If I leave at 6, I can absolutely get there in time. So I took down all of her information, and I was like, I'll be there. And their group was there for a little bit longer, so she went back and kind of joined some of her group, and I checked in on Nancy number 2, the Nancy on the chair, and was like, are you still doing okay? And she was like, yeah, I am. And I went to walk away, and then I noticed she had this big pendant necklace that was some kind of stone that I couldn't immediately place. And I was like, your pendant is beautiful. It's gorgeous. I was like, do you know what kind of stone that is? She's like, I don't know, but thank you. And I was like, yeah. And then as I said that, I noticed she had on 2 really beautiful rings. One was turquoise, and one looked like turquoise, except it was green. And I have a ring that is a stone called Gaspeite that I got when I was in Zion a couple years ago. And I went into the shop, and it was just me and the shopkeeper, and I was like, what is this stone? And he was like, it's Gaspeite. It only comes from 2 places. It comes from Canada, and then I think he said Australia. And I was like, wow, I've never seen this. Almost like lime green, but opaque stone. I'm not wearing it. I should be wearing it. But anyways, I was just like, your jewelry is just really beautiful. And then we had a little chat about she goes and stays in Canada because of the stone and Canada and blah blah blah. I found out that she goes and stays in Canada every summer. And we had a really lovely chat. So I was able to get off. I purchased this book before I left, and I took it with me, and I raced over to the home after I got off work. There was construction, and then it was not obvious how to get in to this place. So I'm kind of running around trying to figure out where the front entrance is. I get in, and I see there's a desk and this really beautiful foyer area. And I'm like, and then there's a sign that's like, you must check in. I was like, okay. So I'm like, hey, I'm checking in. I am here for the poetry reading. And she was like, oh yeah, okay. What's your name? And I was like, it's on the 5th floor. And I was like, Mary told me it was on the 5th floor. And she was like, yeah. So I go up, and then there's another desk, and I was like, I'm here for the poetry reading. And she was like, oh yeah, it's around the corner. I was like, okay. So I go, and I get there. I'm often running late, but I got there 5 minutes before 6:30, and it hadn't started yet. Mary's standing at the front, and she had changed her blouse. It was this pink kind of embroidered folk blouse. It was beautiful. And she saw me walk in, and she gave me this huge smile. And she has 3 kids. One of them lives here, and 2 of them live in Denver. And the one that lives here was there. And then one of them from Denver happened to be visiting and was able to come. So she introduced me to her kids. and I got to sit next to them and chat for a minute. And then Nancy, I had them on this side of me, and I had one empty seat on this side of me. And Nancy, number 2, the beautiful jewelry, came in and walked up and said hello to Mary before it started. And then she turned and she saw me, and she was like, and I was like, from the bookstore. And she was like, yeah, I thought you worked there. And I was like, I do work there. And she was like, well, how do you know Mary? And I was like, I just met her today. And she was like, okay. And I was like, she told me about it when you guys were there, and I was able to come. And she was like, okay. So she came and she sat next to me. And the reading itself was lovely. You could tell that Mary had done it before. She was an old hat at reading, as they say. Practiced. She had tabbed the poems that she wanted to read, and she was really great at, she didn't speak in between all of them, but she spoke in between some and gave us context to some. And so we got to learn a bit about her life through the poems themselves, but also in her like conversational bits of context in between. And there was some really emotional and like heart-wrenching subject matter, but she kind of sprinkled humorous things in between, and it was a really beautiful experience. And afterwards, I looked across the aisle to the row on the same line as me, but on the other side of the aisle, and Nancy number 1 leaned over and gave me a wave, and she came and chatted with me, and I was able to have some conversation with these beautiful women. Mary is 93. Nancy number 2 is in her 80s, and I'm not sure how old Nancy number 1 is. But I met another woman who is in attendance named Jerry, who's in her, I think they said 104. And I don't think I know. I know they said 104. And they were so kind. They were so kind. And spunky. And it was a beautiful experience centered around books and poetry and reading and human connection. And it was lovely. I came home and I originally filmed this video, and I'm realizing I'm missing a piece of the story. That is one of the reasons why I deleted the video and am now filming it for a second time. And it's because the tone of the first video, the story was told much the same, but the tone wasn't quite what I wanted to express. And I am picky. I'm picky. And anyways, a piece of the puzzle, a piece of this story is that after the group left, but before the reading, I was talking to some of my coworkers about this lovely in-store experience that I had had. And one of my coworkers was like, well, I want to read the poem. And so I grabbed it, and she read it, and she had never read Sylvia Plath. And so I gave her the Sylvia Plath pitch, because I am a huge Plath fan. My experience with Plath is in high school, that same class with that same teacher that was very emphatic about the oratory. Actually, to be truthful, I don't know if it was the same class, because I had that teacher for multiple classes. So it was actually probably a different class, but same teacher. But I was in a class where we had these projects and everybody drew an author's name out of a hat. And you were partnered up. So you and your partner would have this author that you had to read certain works of theirs and learn about them and put together a project to present to the class to help teach the class about them. And the author that my partner and I drew out of the hat was Sylvia Plath. And I read The Bell Jar, and I've always been an avid, just voracious reader. But at the time, I was reading a steady stream of YA, and The Bell Jar does not follow the typical YA narrative arc, and I had no idea what to do with this book full of stunning prose and like really hard things where it's just like this happens and then this happens and then this happens and then this happens and then it's over. And I read it once and I was like, I didn't know. And as soon as I finished it, I was like, oh. And I started it again immediately. And the second time through, I was just like soaking it up. And then jumped into reading as much of her poetry as I could find, checked out all the books from the various libraries we had access to. And over the years, I think The Bell Jar I own it, and I think it is my most lent out book. It's the book I've lent out to the most people. And so anyways, I pitched this author. I kind of tell my coworker about her life a little bit and pitch The Bell Jar and her as poet. And long story short, she had just finished her most recent book and was interested in reading The Bell Jar. And so I was like, well, you're welcome to borrow my copy if you'd like. She was like, yeah, I'd like that. And so I snagged my copy of The Bell Jar and a collection of her poems just in case. And like, what a stunning experience with reading in books of human connection and finding new material and learning new things. And anyways, I thought it was so stunning. And I've read through about half of this book of poetry because I take the time to read it out loud and really chew on it. And it's wonderful. I did a little bit of research on Mary when I got home. She, I told you she's 93 and she closed up her studio, her pottery studio last year. She was actively, making pottery until very recently. And on one of her other volumes, she has two of her volumes have pieces of her work on the front, and the other one is a vase that has a face on the front that is like kind of split down the middle and part of it's up higher than the other. She said that it was she made that piece intentionally for the cover, and she used a cast of her face for the vase, which I think is very cool. Anyways, stunning experience, something that I felt like was super cool and wanted to share. In other news, I have so many books to talk about. This video is already about a half an hour long, and so we're not going to dive into any of that, but I will say, I don't know, book adjacent note, I don't know who has read The Wheel of Time and is watching it. I have not read it, but I am watching it. I watched the first and second seasons like as they came out, and then I just finished re-listening to seasons 1 and 2 in preparation for watching season 3. I just finished episode 1 of season 3 earlier today. And in re-listening to the first and second season, I was reminded about how annoying I find Nynaeve's character. I have a very hard time with her character. I hope that she goes through some really great character growth to a point where, like, I really like her character, because I feel like we're supposed to, but I really don't. I really don't. And as a spoiler, but not a huge spoiler, like, her romance, that's what I'll say. The romance that she is involved in is, like, completely unbelievable to me. I don't buy it. I don't believe it. It's acting. I don't buy it. There's no chemistry. There's like no, I don't buy it. Anyway, beautiful experiences. I hope you guys are all enjoying what you're reading things you're enjoying, having gorgeous human connections, whether they're book centered or not. And I will talk to you later. Bye.